It was the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. Back then, the roads seemed a bit wilder, especially those in Northern California, where civilization gave way to miles of dense, lonely forests. I was hitchhiking, a way of life I had adopted a few years ago, seeking adventures that didn't always end as planned. My route was taking me north towards Oregon, but at that specific moment, I was on the outskirts of a small coastal town, miles away from anything that could be called civilization. The road I was on seemed to cut through the dark green vastness of the trees like a thin blade, separating two different worlds. On one side, the forest seemed to close in on itself, a tangle of shadows and mysteries stretching as far as the eye could see. On the other, the ocean relentlessly crashed against the rocks, emitting a constant, almost hypnotic sound. There were no cars passing by, and the loneliness was palpable, as if the world had forgotten this piece of land. I was walking with my dog by my side, a faithful companion who always gave me a sense of security amidst this solitude. However, on that day, even with her beside me, the feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. Every noise from the forest, every whisper of the wind through the trees made me glance over my shoulder. The road, long and straight, seemed to stretch on infinitely, and the small town ahead was my only hope of finding a bit of safety, a bit of humanity. But something about that place told me that the night held secrets I might not want to discover. And it was with this thought, this mixture of curiosity and fear, that I continued my walk, ignoring the shiver that ran down my spine. I was standing by the roadside, trying to stay calm while looking out at the horizon. My dog, always alert, was by my side, her ears twitching at every sound the wind brought from the dense forest. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Suddenly, in the middle of that deserted expanse, I saw something approaching on the road. It was an RV trailer, moving slowly, almost as if it were patrolling the area, sending a shiver down my spine. The vehicle approached slowly, and I could feel the atmosphere around me change. Something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When the RV finally stopped next to me, the engine idling quietly, I waited for the driver to lower the window or say something. Instead, the man stepped out of the cab and came directly to the side of the vehicle where I was standing. I found his behavior unusual, as if he wanted to get too close, unnecessarily so. He was tall, with a hard expression that conveyed no friendliness. His eyes pierced me, as if he were trying to read my soul, and that made me uncomfortable in a way few things ever had. As he walked towards me, I felt the weight of the silence between us grow, and my hand instinctively tightened around my dog's leash, who curiously remained still, without growling or barking. The man stopped a few feet from me, and without a word opened the side door of the RV. Then he spoke, his voice firm and commanding. "Get in." It wasn't an invitation, it was an order, and that made me even more suspicious. I stared at him, trying to decipher his intentions, but his expression remained impassive. Everything in me screamed to refuse, but there was something in the way he carried himself, in the way he seemed to know I was afraid, that made the moment feel surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. At that moment, I realized that fate was testing me, and the choice I made then could change everything. As soon as the man opened the RV door and ordered me to get in, something inside me awakened, like a silent alarm that goes off in moments of imminent danger. There was something profoundly wrong with that situation, something that made me want to run as fast as I could. My heart began to beat faster, and my mind, usually calm, was now on high alert. Every fiber of my being told me that this man was not just a stranger offering a ride, he was a threat. As I stared at him, I noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. He was tall, but not in a way that commanded respect, rather in a way that intimidated. His body seemed rigid, almost forced, as if he was restraining himself from doing something. The clothes he wore were ordinary, but there was something odd about how they appeared slightly disheveled, as if he had put them on hastily or didn't care about his appearance. What disturbed me the most, however, were his eyes. They were cold, lifeless, like two black pits that absorbed all the light around them. His gaze was fixed, intense, and conveyed a sense of emptiness, as if he was trying to see something inside me that I didn't want him to see. He didn't blink, and that made me even more uncomfortable. It was as if he was used to intimidating people just with his presence, as if he knew that his stare was enough to break anyone's resistance. But what truly chilled my blood was the way he seemed at ease with my fear, as if he was feeding off it. It was almost as if he knew I was terrified and was just waiting for the right moment to act. With every passing second, my discomfort grew. I could feel cold sweat running down my back, while the air around us seemed to become denser, heavier. My dog, who had always been my source of security, remained motionless, which only added to my unease. Normally, she would have growled or barked, but now she was completely paralyzed. It was as if she, too, felt the same terror I did. In that moment, I knew I needed to make a decision quickly. My survival depended on it. Something told me that if I got into that RV, there would be no turning back. The sense of danger was almost tangible, and the fear, which had once been a subtle warning, was now an overwhelming force pushing me away from that man. The only thing I knew for certain was that I needed to get out of there, and fast. As I tried to maintain my composure in front of that disturbing man, something caught my attention, and for a moment diverted my gaze from the stranger. My dog, my faithful companion, who had always been a source of comfort and security for me, was behaving in a completely different manner. She, who never hesitated to face anything she considered a threat, was now trembling violently. Her fur, normally bristling when she sensed danger, was lying flat, and she could barely move, as if she were paralyzed by fear. I had never seen her like this before. This was the same dog that had scared off strangers with her fierce growl, the same dog that wasn't afraid to face the dark or protect our space. But now, in the presence of this man, she was reduced to a state of complete terror. I knew instinctively that something was very wrong. Dogs have a sixth sense, an almost supernatural ability to perceive what humans cannot. And if she was this frightened, it was because there was something profoundly evil about that man. This realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Her panic began to seep into me, contaminating the little rationality I was still trying to hold on to. If my dog was like this, what did that say about the situation I was in? My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but all I could think was that something terrible was about to happen, something I needed to escape from as quickly as possible. Her change in behavior had a devastating effect on me. The fear that had been lurking before now took over my entire body. I started to feel like her, small, vulnerable, and powerless in the face of whatever that man was. Every tremor of hers seemed to resonate within me, intensifying the feeling that we were on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into something horrible and inescapable. The situation, which was already terrifying, became unbearable. Her panic became my panic, and in that moment, the only thing I knew for certain was that we needed to get out of there. Any hope that this was just a coincidence or a misunderstanding vanished. This was real, and it was dangerous. And for the first time in a long while, I felt completely powerless in the face of what was coming. The dilemma forming in my mind was overwhelming. Part of me wanted to follow logic, accept the ride. After all, it was what I had been looking for. An opportunity to move forward in my journey without having to walk miles along the deserted road. But the other part, the more primal one, was screaming at me, begging me to refuse, to get away from that man and that RV. The visceral fear that had settled within me wouldn't allow me to ignore the signs. Every survival instinct I had was shouting that something terrible would happen if I got into that vehicle. I looked again at my dog, still trembling with fear, and that gave me the clarity I needed. If even she, who was always so brave, was terrified, I couldn't ignore it. I decided at that moment that no matter how much my mind tried to rationalize the situation, I couldn't afford to take the risk. Our safety, hers and mine, was worth more than any temporary comfort that ride might offer. I took a deep breath, trying to appear calm, and forced a smile as I responded to the man. "No, thank you. I think we'll keep walking." My voice came out a bit shaky, but I hoped he wouldn't notice. Every word I spoke seemed to increase the tension in the air. The decision was made, but the threat still hung in the atmosphere, dense and almost palpable. The man didn't react as I expected. Instead of accepting my refusal with indifference or even disappointment, his gaze became even colder, almost predatory. The muscles in my body tensed, as if expecting an attack that never came. His eyes, already disturbing, now seemed to pierce through me, as if he were trying to intimidate me, forcing me to reconsider. He didn't say anything, but the atmosphere around us shifted. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper, as if time had slowed down, trapping us in that moment of pure tension. The panic inside me increased, but I maintained my composure. I knew I needed to get out of there, and fast. I took a step back, still keeping my eyes on him, while I tugged on my dog's leash, urging her to move. The feeling that something very bad was about to happen was almost overwhelming, but at the same time, there was a strange certainty growing within me. The decision to refuse that ride had saved me. I didn't know exactly from what, but I knew that if I had gotten into that RV, my story might have ended there. Finally, I managed to walk away, feeling the man's eyes drilling into my back as I distanced myself. The silence, which had been almost unbearable before, now felt like a relief, though I could still sense the lurking threat, like a shadow that wouldn't disappear anytime soon. I kept walking without looking back, feeling the weight of the danger slowly fading, but leaving a deep mark on my mind. I had escaped by a narrow margin, but I knew that moment, that sinister figure would stay with me for a long time. As soon as I decided to refuse the ride and walked away from that man, my survival instinct took full control. I pulled my dog, who seemed as relieved as I was to be getting out of there, and we started to quickly move away. Every step we took was an effort to increase the distance between us and that sinister RV. I didn't look back. I didn't want to risk seeing something that would make me stop. The only thing that mattered at that moment was reaching the town as quickly as possible. As we got closer, the town's lights began to appear on the horizon, small and faint in the distance, but to me, they looked like beacons of hope. It was as if each one was a promise of safety, of people, of normalcy. I felt a small sense of relief growing inside me, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was really escaping danger. However, this relief was fragile, easily shattered by the persistent feeling that something was still wrong. Even with the town in sight, I couldn't shake the idea that we were being watched. That weight in the air, that sense of being under constant surveillance, wouldn't leave me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a clear sign that the threat hadn't completely disappeared. The silence around us was broken only by the sound of our hurried footsteps on the road, but every shadow seemed to be moving. Every noise seemed to come from something following us. I looked around several times, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of the fear that hadn't yet dissipated. But nothing seemed right. It was as if the presence of that man, or something worse, was extending to here, somehow pursuing me. There was nothing visible, but the feeling was as real as the ground beneath my feet. When we finally reached the town, that small relief grew a bit more, but the fear was still there, persistent, like a shadow that refuses to disappear even under the light. We entered the lit streets, surrounded by houses and small shops, but I still felt like something or someone was watching us, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fact that we were in a place with other people gave me a bit more security, but I knew that whatever that encounter on the road had been, it wouldn't be easy to forget. The town protected me for now, but the memory of that man and the sense of danger continued to haunt me, like a ghost I couldn't simply leave behind. After I finally reached the relative safety of the town, I began to reflect on what could have happened if I had accepted that ride. Every time I thought about that man's expression, the cold, empty stare, I felt a chill run down my spine. The scenario of getting into that RV and never being seen by anyone again played out in my mind like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. And the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that fate had given me a chance to escape something truly terrible. I couldn't shake the idea that my dog's behavior was what saved me. She, always so brave, was petrified with fear in front of that man. It was as if she had sensed something my eyes couldn't see, a threat that transcended what was visible and understandable. The connection between her fear and the imminent danger was undeniable. Something was profoundly wrong, something that went beyond common understanding. And the only explanation that made sense, no matter how irrational it might seem, was that there was a supernatural or malevolent force lurking in that encounter. That event didn't just mark that day, it left a deep scar on me. In the long run, I realized that the encounter affected me in ways I wasn't prepared to face. Paranoia settled into my life as a constant companion. The idea that someone or something was following me never completely left me. Sometimes at night, when the silence was too deep, I found myself hearing sounds that weren't there, seeing shadows that shouldn't exist. The nightmares began shortly after. Always the same scenario: me on the deserted road and the man in the RV. Except in the dreams, I didn't refuse the ride. I got in. And what happened afterward was a blur of pure terror, a void that consumed me until I woke up, sweating and my heart pounding as if I had been running for my life. Each time I woke from those nightmares, I felt the line between dream and reality was becoming increasingly thin. My dog was never the same either. She, who had always been brave and protective, seemed to have lost something in that encounter. She became more cautious, more nervous. She avoided certain areas, growled at harmless shadows, and sometimes cowered at the slightest sign of danger. It seemed that the fear she felt that day had taken root in her, just as it had in me. And so, even with the passage of time, the encounter on the road continued to haunt me. It wasn't just a memory, it was a constant presence, a reminder that sometimes danger doesn't manifest in obvious ways, but hides in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And despite being safe in the town, I knew deep down that I would never truly be free of that man, of that threat I had felt so deeply. Looking back on everything that happened, one thing became clear to me. Trusting strangers is a risk that, in certain situations, can be fatal, especially when you're alone, in isolated places, where the presence of other people is rare. Sometimes, danger doesn't present itself in an obvious way, doesn't wear a threatening mask. It can appear as a simple invitation, a ride, a seemingly ordinary figure that hides intentions beyond what we can immediately see or understand. If I had ignored that instinct, that visceral feeling that something was wrong, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. It was my dog's irrational fear, the chill I felt down my spine, that made me stop and think. Small instincts, which we sometimes dismiss as paranoia, can actually be the only thing separating us from real danger. The decision to follow my intuition that day is what saved my life. And so, if I can offer any advice, it's this: never ignore the signals your body and mind give you. They exist for a reason. But even with that awareness, I can't shake the feeling that that man is still out there. Maybe on another deserted road, maybe in another RV, waiting for his next victim. The world is full of dangers that aren't always visible at first glance, and though I was lucky that day, others might not be. The road can be treacherous, and danger, disguised as help, might be lurking in places where we least expect it.